Some men measure their lives by what they built. Fences that held, cattle that fattened, a porch that didn't sag until they were old enough to sag with it. My father measured his by the door he never opened for a hungry woman on a February morning, and by the 6 words she said before she turned to leave. I've told a lot of stories in my time. Most of them I made bigger than they were, the way old men do, so the fire has something to eat while the coffee cools. But this one I've kept small. I've kept it the exact size it happened, because the moment you dress it up, you lose the thing that made it matter. And what made it matter was how ordinary it started. A cold day, a knock, a no. If you've ever said no to someone and spent the rest of your life wondering what it cost you, stay with me. Because I watched a proud, hard, decent man learn that the smallest voice in the room can carry the heaviest weight, and I never saw him the same way again. This is the story of the winter my father turned away a widow, and what her quiet words did to all of us after. The knock came twice, and the second one was softer than the first, like whoever stood out there had already half decided we weren't going to answer. I was 11, and I remember the sound because I remember being annoyed by it. I was lying on the floor by the stove where the heat pooled, tracing the grain of the boards with my thumbnail, and the knock pulled me out of a warmth I'd worked hard to find. It was the kind of cold that year that got into the nail heads and made the whole house tick and pop like it was thinking about giving up. We'd lost 2 calves the week before, frozen stiff in the north draw, and my father had come in that night with ice in his mustache and a look on his face I'd learned not to talk to. His name was Elias Warren. People called him Warren, even his friends, because he wasn't a first-name kind of man. He ranched a hard patch of ground in the high country where the wind had opinions and the soil had none, and he'd buried a wife and a middle son on that ground and kept working it anyway, because stopping felt too much like admitting the ground had won. That's me talking now, the old man version. At 11, I just knew he was big and quiet, and that his hands smelled like leather and cold iron, and that when he sat in the evenings, he sometimes stared at the empty chair across the table long enough that I'd get up and stand near him so he'd have something to look at that was still breathing. The knock came a third time. "You gonna get that?" he said. It wasn't a question. He was at the table with a bridle in his lap, working oil into a strap that didn't need it. He did that when the day had beaten him, found a small thing to fix so he could believe the world was fixable. I opened the door. She was maybe 30, though the cold and whatever she'd been through had added years to her the way weather adds them to a fence post. Thin. Not fashionable thin, not the kind you choose. The other kind. Her coat had been good once, you could tell by the cut of the collar, but it had been mended so many times at the elbows that the mending had become the coat. She had a child on her hip, a girl, bundled so thoroughly that only a slice of face showed, 2 dark eyes and a nose gone red. And behind her, half hidden in her skirts, a boy of maybe 6, holding the hem the way a drowning man holds a rope. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said. Her voice was low and careful, a voice that had learned to apologize before it asked. "We've come a long way. I wondered if you might have any work. Or," and here she faltered and I watched her decide to say the true thing instead of the safe thing, "or anything to spare. For the children, I can pay in labor. I'm not asking for charity if there's another way." Behind me, I heard the bridle stop. "I want to tell you my father got up and brought them in and set them by the fire, and that we were the kind of people the stories are about. But I've kept this the size it happened." "No work here," he said. He didn't get up. "Barely work enough for me and the boy." "I understand." She said it fast like she'd expected it. "Then I won't keep you. If you could just, a little food, whatever you'd throw out, I'd be grateful. The little one hasn't eaten since." She stopped herself. Pride and hunger were fighting in her, and I could see hunger losing, which is a terrible thing to watch, because hunger only loses when pride has nothing left to defend. My father set the bridle aside then. He stood, and I felt a leap of hope in my chest because I thought now he does the thing. He crossed to the door. He looked at her and at the boy in her skirts, and at the small red face on her hip. And something moved behind his eyes that I didn't have words for then and barely have words for now. It looked like fear. I couldn't understand why a man that size would be afraid of a woman that thin. "We don't have it to give," he said. "Times are hard for everyone. You'll find a church in town 4 miles down. They do that sort of thing." It was a lie, and I knew it was a lie. There was salt pork in the smokehouse and beans in the barrel and a whole shelf of Mother's preserves that nobody had the heart to open because opening them meant admitting she wasn't coming back to make more. We had it to give. We just weren't going to. The woman nodded. She'd heard the town end church answer before, you could tell by how little it landed. "Thank you for your time," she said, and it wasn't bitter. That's the part that stayed with me. There wasn't a drop of bitterness in it, just a tiredness so deep it had gone quiet. She turned to go, got the boy pointed down the steps, shifted the girl higher on her hip. And then she paused and turned back, not angry, not begging, just settling something, making sure she left it behind her the way you'd set down a stone you'd carried too far. She looked at my father and she said 6 words. "You had a mother once too." That was all, no accusation in it. She said it the way you'd remind someone of the weather. Then she went down the steps and out into the white, the boy trotting to keep up, the girl's face bobbing over her shoulder, watching us shrink as they walked away. My father shut the door. He stood with his hand flat against the wood for a long moment. I watched his back. I watched his shoulders, which were the kind of shoulders that had carried dead calves and dead sons and a dead wife, and had not once in my memory bent. And I watched them bend. "Get away from the window," he said, though I wasn't near the window. He went back to the table. He picked up the bridle. He set it down again. He picked it up. His hands, those big competent hands that could gentle a spooked horse and set a broken fence in a blizzard, could not find the strap. I didn't understand yet. I was 11 and the whole thing had lasted maybe 2 minutes, and to me, it was just a strange cold visit that had upset my father for reasons I couldn't reach. I thought about the girl's red nose. I thought about how the boy had held the skirts. I did not yet understand that I'd watched something break, and that broken things, sometimes, are the beginning of a man and not the end of him. We ate that night in silence. Salt pork, beans. He looked at the shelf of preserves twice. The wind got worse after dark. It came down off the ridge the way it did in the bad years, with a sound in it like something calling, and I lay in my bed and listened to the house tick and pop, and I thought about 3 people walking into that. 4 miles to town. In that. I heard him get up. I heard the floorboards and the particular groan of the 3rd stair, and then the door of the smokehouse, which had a hinge you could hear from the moon. I got up and went to the window and scraped a hole in the frost with my thumbnail, and I saw him out there in the blue dark, no coat, just his shirt, standing in the snow with a lantern, looking down the road the widow had taken. He stood there a long time, long enough that his shirt went stiff, long enough that I got cold just watching, and then he did a thing I have never forgotten and have never fully explained. He set the lantern down in the middle of the road. Right in the middle, where anyone coming or going would see it. A light in the dark, 4 miles from town, pointed at nothing, helping no one, because the only people it could have helped were already gone into the white and wouldn't be coming back this way. He stood beside it another minute. Then he came inside and I heard him at the table again, and this time I heard something I'd never heard from him. Not once. Not at the funerals. Not at the graves. I heard my father crying. Quiet. Trying to swallow it. A big man making himself small so the sound wouldn't carry to the boy sleeping in the next room. I didn't go to him. I've regretted that a little all my life, that I let him think I didn't hear. But I understood, even at 11, that some grief a man wants to keep, and that the kindest thing I could do was give him the dark to keep it in. In the morning, the lantern was out. He brought it in and cleaned the glass and never said a word about it. But he was different, small things. He started leaving the smokehouse unlocked. He put a board up at the end of the road, hand-painted, that said work and MEALS, inquire. And when I asked him what happened to barely enough for me and the boy, he looked at the board a long moment and said, "A man can be wrong twice. Once when he does the thing. Once when he keeps being the kind of man who'd do it. Then he went to fix a fence that didn't need fixing." I thought that was the end of it. A hard lesson learned. A man improved by a stranger he'd wronged. But I hadn't understood yet who she was. I hadn't understood why 6 ordinary words had gone into my father like a blade finding a seam in armor. I found that out 3 weeks later, when the snow finally broke, and a letter came, and my father read it standing up and then sat down very suddenly in the chair across from the empty one, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him. But that's the second part of it, and the second part is the part that changed everything. The letter came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the widow. On the first day the road was passable enough for the male rider to make the run without killing his horse. I remember it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays my father sharpened things. Knives, the axe, the plow blades, the long shears we used on the horse's feet. He'd sit on the back step with the whetstone and a can of oil and work in long even strokes, and the sound of it, that patient hiss, steel on stone, was the sound of our house being ready for the week. He was on the third knife when the rider came up the road, and he didn't stop sharpening until the man was close enough to hand the letter down without dismounting. "Warren," the rider said by way of everything, "hello, here, goodbye." And then he was gone back down the road toward the next place, leaning into the wind. My father looked at the envelope a long time before he opened it. That wasn't like him. He was a man who did the next thing and then the thing after that. Hesitation wasn't in his kit. But he turned that envelope over twice, and I saw him read the return hand on the back, and I saw something go still in his face. "Who's it from?" I asked. He didn't answer. He set the knife down on the step and he set the whetstone down beside it, careful, the way you set down things you might not pick up again for a while. Then he opened the letter standing up and read it standing up, and when he was done he sat down in the kitchen, crossed the whole house to do it, and sat in the chair across from the empty one. My mother's chair. He never sat there. In 4 years I'd never once seen him sit there. And he sat there now with the letter in both hands, and looked at me like he'd forgotten I could see him. "Pa." "Her name was Ruth Callan," he said. "Who's?" "The woman at the door." He said it slow, like the words had weight he had to lift one at a time. "The one with the children, her name was Ruth Callan. I didn't know it then. I do now." He set the letter on the table between us and smoothed it flat with the side of his hand, and I understood I was allowed to read it. So I did, though I was 11 and half the words in it went over my head and only landed years later when I was old enough to feel their edges. It was from a woman in town, the minister's wife, it turned out, and it was a thank you. That's the first strange thing. It thanked my father. It thanked him for the lantern. Because Ruth Callan and her 2 children had not gone to town that night. 4 miles was too far and the dark had come too fast, and she'd known, the way people who have been cold a long time come to know these things, that she wouldn't make it carrying the girl. So she turned off the road looking for any shelter she could find, a lee, a windbreak, anything, and she'd seen a light. A lantern set in the middle of the road pointed at nothing. She'd walked back to it, and from it she could see the shape of our smokehouse against the snow, and she'd gone to it and found it. This is the second strange thing, the thing that made my father sit down in that chair. She'd found it unlocked. But he'd locked it. I'd heard the hinge. I'd have sworn on anything he locked it. He hadn't. When I read that part aloud, he closed his eyes and I watched him remember. "I went out to lock it," he said. "I had the lock in my hand. I stood there and I couldn't." He stopped. "I told myself I forgot. A man tells himself all kinds of things so he doesn't have to look at what he did on purpose. He'd left it open on purpose and told himself it was an accident. Because leaving it open on purpose meant admitting he was the kind of man who turned a woman away and then couldn't live with it. and admitting that was a longer walk than 4 miles in the snow. So Ruth Callan and her children had spent that killing night in our smokehouse, wrapped in the burlap and the old horse blankets, and in the morning before light, before any of us stirred, she'd taken exactly enough. The letter was specific because Ruth had been specific with the minister's wife, had insisted on it. She'd taken one side of salt pork, a double handful of beans in a twist of cloth, and 2 jars of my mother's preserves. And she'd left the rest. And she'd stacked the horse blankets. And on the workbench, in the dust, she'd written with her finger a single word, which the letter reported and which my father went out to the smokehouse to see for himself. And it was still there, because none of us had been in since. Thank you. That's not the part that undid him, though. I thought it was, watching his face, but it wasn't. The letter went on. It explained who Ruth Callan was because the minister's wife assumed my father knew or wanted him to. Ruth was a widow, yes. Her husband had died the previous spring. His name was Thomas Callan. And my father knew that name. I didn't then, but I watched it hit him, and I've spent a long time since learning the shape of what it was. Thomas Callan had been a cattle buyer, a middling one, honest enough, who worked the high country in the good years buying stock off the small ranches to drive to the railhead. And 4 years before, the same spring my mother died, the same spring the fever came through and took her and took my brother inside a single terrible week, Thomas Callan had come to our place to buy, and my father had turned him away. Not cruelly. Just, Warren had no stock to sell that year, and no heart to haggle, and a wife and a boy fresh in the ground. And when Callan came up the road with his book and his easy talk, my father had met him at the gate and said, "Not this year and not you, and don't come back," and had said it hard, harder than the man deserved, because Callan had had the bad luck to be a stranger asking my father for something in the worst week of his life. Warren had turned his grief into a door and shut it in a decent man's face. He'd forgotten it. That's the cruelty of it. To the man who does the turning away, it's Tuesday. To the man turned away, it can be the day everything went wrong. Thomas Callan had gone on down the road that spring, and the next place he'd stopped at had cattle to sell, and a sick cow in the pen that nobody knew was sick. And Callan bought and drove, and by the railhead half the herd was down with it, and so was he. And the fever that came through our country that year, the same fever that took my mother, it may have come with him or come for him. Nobody could say. But Thomas Callan died of it that summer in a town 2 counties over. Far from a wife, who never learned exactly where, until a letter caught up with her the following spring. Ruth Callan had spent the last of what they had burying rumors and chasing the truth of where her husband died. And then she'd started walking, toward relatives she wasn't sure would take her, through country she didn't know. And on a February morning, by chance, by the pure blind arithmetic of a hard road, she'd knocked on the door of the one man who turned her husband away at the start of the year that killed him. She hadn't known. That's what the letter said, and my father believed it, and so do I. She hadn't known whose door it was. When she said you had a mother once too, she wasn't reaching into his history and finding the exact wound. She was just a tired woman saying a true thing to a hard man, the way you might say it to anyone, the way you say the last thing you've got when you've got nothing else. But he had known. Not who she was, he learned that from the letter. But standing at that door, looking at the thin woman and the 2 cold children, some part of Elias Warren had recognized the shape of a debt he couldn't name, and the fear I'd seen behind his eyes, the fear I couldn't understand in a man that size, was the fear of a man who has just glimpsed the far edge of something he did, and does not yet know its name, and knows only that it is his. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt. Over the pocket he kept things in that mattered. He had a photograph in there, and a lock of hair I never asked about, and he stood up from my mother's chair. "Get your coat," he said. We went to town. 4 miles, the same 4 miles in the wagon, on a road just clear enough to risk it. He didn't say what for, and I didn't ask. At the church, the minister's wife came out onto the steps with her shawl pulled tight, and she and my father talked low while I held the horses, and I saw him ask something, and I saw her shake her head, and I saw his jaw set. Ruth Callan was gone. She'd stayed in town a week, taken in by the church, and then a wagon had come through headed north for the relatives she'd been walking toward, and she'd gone with it, the boy and the girl bundled in the back, and no one had a firm address, only a county and a family name and a direction. My father wrote it all down. The county, the name, the direction. He wrote it in the little book he kept for cattle on a fresh page, and he underlined it. And here's where I could tell you he found them. That he spent a year and a fortune and tracked Ruth Callan to a farmhouse in the North Country and set right what he'd done. That there was a reunion, a table, the two children grown fat and warm, my mother's preserves replaced tenfold. That's how the story wants to end. That's how I wanted it to end for years, and in the versions I told myself at night I did end it there, because a boy needs his father's story to have a floor under it. But I've kept this the size it happened. He wrote to that county. He wrote 3 times over 2 years. The first letter came back unopened. The second didn't come back at all, which he chose to believe meant it arrived. The third he never sent. I found it after he died, still in the cattle book, sealed, addressed in his careful hand to Mrs. Ruth Callan or family, and I have never opened it, and I never will, because whatever a hard man finally found the words to say to a woman he wronged twice over, once at his gate and once at his door, is between the two of them and the God they each in their own way believed in. He never found them. He never knew if the children lived. He carried it the rest of his life, and it changed him the way a stone in a boot changes how a man walks. You learn to step around the pain, and after a while the new step is just how you move. But the board stayed up at the end of the road, work and MEALS, inquire. And in the years that followed, a lot of tired people came up that road. And not one of them was ever turned away. And my father fed drifters and widows and broke men and runaway boys with a consistency that his neighbors found strange in a man who'd never been soft. He'd feed them and put them to work if they wanted it and let them go with something if they didn't, and he never explained it. And only I knew that every single one of them was Ruth Callan, that he was setting a lantern in the road every time, pointed at nothing, in the hope that some night the light would fall on the one person it was meant for. He died when I was 34. Winter, of course. That country takes its own back in winter. And the last thing he did that I'd call remarkable, he did 2 days before, when he was too weak to sit the whetstone step and had me bring the cattle book to the bed so he could look at it. He turned to the underlined page, the county, the name, the direction. He looked at it a long time, and then he took the pencil, and under it all, in a hand gone shaky, he wrote one more line and turned the book so I could read it, and it was the only time in my life I ever heard him come close to asking me for anything. "If she ever comes," he wrote, "or hers, you feed them, you hear me, whatever we've got." I said I would. He turned the book back and looked at the page a while longer. Then he closed it, and he handed it to me, and he said the last clear thing he ever said to me, which wasn't goodbye and wasn't I love you, though I've come to understand it was both. "She was right," he said. "I did have a mother once." Then he closed his eyes. I've kept the board up. It's my road now, my ground, my hard patch of high country with its opinionated wind, and the board at the end of it is on its 4th painting, but it says the same thing my father said. Work and MEALS, inquire. And I keep a lantern trimmed in full by the smokehouse door, and on the bad nights, the killing nights, when the wind comes down off the ridge with that sound in it like something calling, I take it out and I set it in the middle of the road. Pointed at nothing. For anyone who's still walking.